Good evening and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dan Sutter with the Johnson Center for Political Economy here at Troy University. Economists have long been interested and fascinated with the business cycle, the ups and downs in our economy, and illustrated by the recent 2008 recession and previously by the Great Depression. And so it's only natural that economists have attempted to study and come up with explanations for why we have business cycles. Here to talk with us this evening about the business cycle, and in particular a theory of the business cycle known as Austrian business cycles, is my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. Malavika Nair.
Well,
Mel, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, before we get started here, I guess it would probably be best if we mentioned for our viewers exactly what we mean by the business cycle.
So business cycles are defined as large fluctuations in output or employment, anything that is far away from the trend line of the GDP.
Okay.
So if you have large movements in real GDP, something that kind of deviates from the trend, we define that to be a business cycle.
So here we have this graph that's illustrating, and so the fact that we have ups and downs here, this graph is drawn in such a way that we have the average growth rate over the 50-year period is horizontal, so it's these deviations, right?
Right, exactly. It's the deviations, and as you can see, there's a few characteristics that kind of go along with every business cycle. You always tend to have a boom phase or a bubble. It's like the upswing. There seems to be a lot of optimism in the economy. Prices seem to be rising. There's always typically some kind of asset bubble. So in the most recent recession, we had a housing bubble. There was huge increases in the prices of houses. In the 1920s, we had a stock market bubble. And typically, you see this huge run up in prices and everything seems to be going really well. Everybody's making money. But then there's always a turning point that comes. And then that turning point leads into the recession phase, where you see significant decrease in output, in employment, and prices as well.
And a lot of times, though, as we continue on in an expansion, we start to hear people talk about how maybe we won't have another recession. We've somehow cured the business cycle, but we haven't done that today.
No, that's not true. Yeah.
And in fact, given that in a market economy, that there's so much job creation and job destruction, so much churning of new businesses coming into existence and old products becoming obsolete. I mean, it's possible that a business cycle to some extent might actually be a good thing for the economy, right?
Yes, I think so. If the boom or the bubble phase was caused by a misallocation of resources, then the recession would be a good necessary correction.
So how would it be? Like some type of medicine that we have to take occasionally, or
you can think of it that way. I mean, or you can think of it like a hangover. If it's similar to that. It's something which can be necessary, which can be good for the economy, for resources to be allocated back, or for prices to go back to doing the job that they do under normal circumstances.
So occasionally, things like this, like I have a couple of bank runs and a panic in 1920. Occasionally, something like this might be necessary to help us reallocate resources.
Right. Yes, it is unfortunate and it can be painful, but unfortunately, it can be the only thing that is required.
Now, market economies tend to be more susceptible to the business cycles than, say, planned economies, correct?
That is very correct. These business cycles are only kind of witnessed in capitalist economies. And that's a real puzzle because, capitalist economies are based on the market. And the market does the work of allocating resources, it's entrepreneurs, and the price system seems to work well, mostly, right? And it's the profits and the losses which send the signals to entrepreneurs of what to produce, how to produce. The real puzzle with business cycles is why did so many entrepreneurs seem to make the same mistake at the same time? When under normal circumstances, there are some people making mistakes, but then there's others who are doing well and making profits, and the market economy under normal circumstances kind of evens out the differences. But a business cycle is kind of everybody seems to be really euphoric at the same time, and then everybody's making losses at the same time, and that's the real puzzle.
Well, of course, the economics exhibits a number of these paradoxes or puzzles, and they're persistent, and I think that's why they attract people like us to
exactly,
study,
right?
because they're challenging.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, even if there is some value to having a recession in some way, shape, or form, some seem to go on for much longer than there's any need to. And here we have some pictures from the Great Depression, which would clearly be a case of a recession that
lasted a very
was
long
way
time.
too long. Yes,
right.
and just to illustrate this, here's the a graph of the unemployment rate from the Great Depression. So clearly, this doesn't appear to be the kind of thing that we could have needed as a corrective mechanism.
Right. I mean, so there's different reasons of why it lasted so long. As you can see, the unemployment did go up to 25% of the workforce, which is extremely high, and it did last long into the early 40s, and some people say even till after the World War II.
Right, until at least the World War II.
Exactly.
Now, with the Great Depression on, not surprisingly, a lot of economists at the time were trying to come up with an explanation for this this unprecedented phenomenon, especially the length and depth of the recession. And at the time, two of the leading economists in the world were the gentlemen pictured here, Friedrich Hayek and John Maynard Keynes. And not surprisingly, they both offered their own theories of the business cycle during the Great Depression. Now, Keynes's theory is fairly familiar to economists, and even you hear the term Keynesian used in policy discussion, popular policy discussions. But Hayek's theories have been less well understood or accepted by economists. Could you tell us a little bit about Hayek's theory and how it related to like the Austrian business cycle theory?
So you're correct that Keynesian theory is very popular, and Keynesian theory, well, in a nutshell, says that capitalist economies tend to get into these business cycles or into these bad underemployment equilibria, that a capitalist economy will get into this place and there's no way for it to get out by itself, that we need more government intervention. So for Keynes, a business cycle is very much inherent in the market system, in the capitalist market system.
And actually, that was part of Marx's view as well. Karl Marx thought that.
Yeah,
right?
Definitely there is a connection there. There is a similarity. But for Hayek, it's completely different. Hayek saw business cycles not as a result of something inherent in a market capitalist economy, but as a result of manipulation of the money supply.
Okay.
And his business cycle theory has a few different components. One is the role of interest rates. So the interest rate for Hayek is not just the money rate or the money rate that we pay on loans. It's something that kind of permeates the whole economy. And it's a price, basically.
Right.
It's a price that signals to entrepreneurs how much they need to invest and in which part of the capital structure of production they need to invest. So should an entrepreneur set up a new Walmart, something that's going to be selling goods to consumers that consumers can consume right away, or should a businessman be building a steel mill? That kind of investment is something that is very far removed from consumption or consumers. And the interest rate is what tells entrepreneurs whether they should invest in much longer periods of production or in shorter terms of production. So now to Hayek, when, let's say, the central bank or the Federal Reserve is able to manipulate interest rates in a way that they don't reflect the true amount of savings in the economy, that is when you can have a whole bubble or a boom get started in the capital structure of production. So
you talk about the interest rate being an important signal to investors and business owners. What does a high interest rate tell them versus what does a low interest rate tell them?
Well, high interest rate tells you that you should probably invest in shorter periods of production. Right? And a lower interest rate tells you should invest in longer periods of production. If consumers save more, that is what should basically, the interest rate should reflect changes in consumers' savings. If interest rates are fluctuating basically because of the amount of money supply in the system, that means interest rates don't necessarily reflect the correct amount of savings in the system. So it can be that interest rates are driven too low or artificially low, way below what consumers are actually saving. So the problem for Hayek becomes then if there is too much investment taking place when it is not backed up by real savings, that investment represents malinvestment, that there is no way that that amount of investment can ever come to fruition. And what we have at the same time is more consumption taking place at one end of the spectrum and just a lot more investment taking place, while in the middle there's just not enough savings or resources to go around. So to him, the correction or the recession is a necessary requirement. It's the boom must turn to bust. That's the difference between Hayek and Keynes, the real difference.
In the Hayekian or Austrian view, is it possible to have a business cycle that's not created or first started by some kind of manipulation of the interest rate?
No, it's not. Only if there is changes in the interest rate that don't reflect true savings, changes in true savings.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's the market system which works at taking away error. The market system takes away error on a regular basis using profits and losses. And that's how, so it's not inherent for the Austrians.
Okay. Now, there's been a bit of a revival of interest in the Austrian business cycle theory, and it has to do with the what we saw with the housing bubble and then the recession of 2008. A number of economists noticed that it seemed like Hayek's explanation and Hayek's theory had something to say in our modern times here. How is that? How has this revival taken place, and what exactly has led this?
Well, with the most current recession, as we can see, I mean, there was this huge housing bubble, and if we look at the interest rate, actual interest rate data and what was going on, we can see that there was, as you can see with the Fed funds rate, which is the base rate that every bank in the economy uses to set their own interest rates, interest rates were slashed in the early 2000s. And this was right after the dot-com bubble, and the Fed slashed interest rates. And that corresponds very closely to the housing bubble. It gave an incentive, if interest rates are really low, to invest in these housing starts. Well, I mean, there were other policies that were kind of promoting more investment in housing as well, but the interest rate too played a key feature. And right about in 2000, late 2005, late 2006, as you can see, the Fed funds rate starts to rise again. And that is when economists say that kind of charts very closely to the beginning of the bust in the housing market, because it was no longer possible for all of these people who had these cheap loans to make their payments anymore, because interest rates were starting to rise. So you had a lot of people defaulting on their mortgages, as well as the whole mortgage-backed security market that had kind of built up around the mortgage market too came down, crashing, and that is what kind of precipitated the whole financial crisis.
So if you could elaborate just briefly here, in how is it that low interest rates helped fuel the housing bubble, per se?
We saw a decrease in a lot of mortgage rates, as well as the lowering interest rates were done through increased money supply. So there was just more money to loan out. Banks were sitting on a lot more money that they were making loans with, and those two factors together helped it along.
And so from a household's perspective, they were thinking about buying a house, a lower interest rate helps them get qualified for a loan, or it would also allow them to buy a larger house than they might otherwise.
Exactly, it's exactly like a price.
So then it's just to then go on from this to say what kind of let's discuss what kind of a bad signal was this sending to producers, because you said the Austrian theory involves a interest rate signal that ends up confusing or to some extent sending a wrong signal to producers about the capital stock. So what message were home builders or others in the economy getting sent by this very low federal funds rate for a while?
Well, they were getting sent the message that there's probably going to be a lot of demand for these houses in the future, and so that there's a lot of profit to be made. And with prices rising, there were people who were, getting into the business of, putting up these houses really quickly. People were getting into the business of flipping houses, buying them and then selling them for a profit. Everybody thought that the housing market is something it's just going to go up and up and up, and that the housing market all over the country, there's no way that it could go down. But Hayek would say, well, this boom or this bubble was being fueled by cheap money and by extremely low interest rates or artificially low interest rates. It wasn't real growth. It wasn't signaling true demand from the point of view of consumers. That entrepreneurs were fooled by these low interest rates and seemingly high profits in the short run.
And so then, as a consequence, in an economy, we just had like too many people investing, in building too many homes. We had too many businesses going, too many people starting businesses, building homes, too many people working as realtors, and those are real costs to the economy, right?
Right, exactly. This is because of the capital structure of production and the concept of the heterogeneity of capital. Just because you have more houses in the boom, and then when the bust comes, it's not that easy to liquidate these houses.
Right.
Capital is heterogeneous. It's very hard for the economy to recover. It doesn't just recover immediately. So the malinvestment represents a true cost on the economy that is hard to get back because capital is different. It's heterogeneous. It's specific.
Right. Exactly. And so you mentioned this heterogeneous capital. What were some other points of Austrian business cycle theory and how they differ maybe from more conventional theories? And how do they help us explain a few elements of cycles?
Well, the capital heterogeneity is important, as well as the role of prices and the role that prices play in a market economy. Prices play the role of signaling true demand or through the underlying data or preferences of consumers. And entrepreneurs in a market economy look at prices and to know what to produce in the future. Now, with manipulations of the interest rate, what happens is that the signals are faulty. Entrepreneurs are looking at these prices, or they're seeing these interest rates fall, and they think that that's what consumers want, that in the future consumers want to buy a lot of houses. But that's not true, because these prices are being manipulated, or the interest rate is being manipulated. But in a normal market economy, the prices play an extremely important role of signaling or sending information to entrepreneurs.
Well, then I know, so that's sort of the basic outlines of the Austrian theory. What have been some of the criticisms of the Austrian theory that maybe led it to have less acceptance amongst economists, or that led other economists to think it was less of a good explanation?
Well, I mean, one common criticism is that, okay, look, how come if entrepreneurs are so smart, usually how come, they get fooled so easily, if the central bank lowers interest rates. And, that's an important kind of criticism. And the answer is, I mean, there's different ways to think about it.
So in this case here, like for instance, in the early 2000s, we have this, when the interest rates are falling, but everybody, at some level, everybody knows what the Fed's doing. They're reducing the federal funds rate. So then the issue is, why did they think that this was actually a change in consumer preferences?
Right. Well, there's a few ways to think about it. One is, we cannot assume that everybody understands how the central bank works and what an interest rate really signals, right? We would have to assume that everybody truly understands that when the Fed lowers interest rates, that that is not necessarily showing what consumer preferences are. Another one is, well, even if it's a bubble and it's going to burst at some point, as an entrepreneur, I mean, why shouldn't you get in the short run just to make a profit, and to get out before it gets bad? And I suspect a lot of entrepreneurs do that. Another way to think about it is, entrepreneurs are different, right? We can't assume that each entrepreneur or each businessman is as good as the other. Yes, entrepreneurs are in the business of forecasting the future and trying to make a profit by forecasting it correctly, right? But we can have a spectrum of entrepreneurial quality. So for Austrian business cycle theory to work, all we need is that some entrepreneurs be fooled by this process. And if you think about the market's mechanism of weeding out bad entrepreneurs and rewarding good entrepreneurs, under normal circumstances, the market gives profit to those entrepreneurs who forecast the future correctly.
Right.
But here, because the underlying signals have been distorted, the market is actually, in the short run, rewarding or giving profits to those who are fooled by the faulty data. So it's almost like the ones who are fooled are the ones making the profit, and the ones who are not fooled are the ones making losses in the short run. So it's the whole market mechanism is turned on its head, basically. In the short run, the whole profit and loss mechanism is turned on its head.
Oh, you mentioned some recent macroeconomic theorizing also points out that monetary policy can be more effective if the monetary policy is unanticipated, or to some extent, if everybody knows what the Fed's going to be doing, then monetary policy is going to have very limited effect. So there would seem to be some incentive for the Federal Reserve to try to be, sneaky.
That's true.
About
That's absolutely
one way to think
right.
of it.
Yeah, because if people expect inflation, they kind of, put that into their calculations already through inflationary expectations. So prices rise before anything else already. So it is true that if everybody expects it, Fed policy can be ineffective. And that's true that the central bank does have an incentive to not, make it absolutely clear what they're going to do now or, in the future.
So it wasn't clear, for instance, in the early 2000s there, exactly how long the Federal Reserve was going to keep interest rates low.
That's right.
We've certainly gone back to very low interest rates since the recession.
Exactly, and a lot of people talk about how we are back at very, very low interest rates now. The Fed funds rate is actually very close to zero. It's never been that low before. It's at 0.25%. And a lot of people say that that is actually hindering recovery, and we're actually running the risk of another bubble and not real economic growth or recovery because of these new low interest rates again.
And certainly in terms of the signals to entrepreneurs, I mean, at the very least, if you were a homeowner and interest rates were low and you could lock in a 30-year mortgage at a low interest rate, you could afford a larger house than you could otherwise. And that translates into actual demand for houses, even if it ends up being unsustainable.
Right.
It was profitable for a while to be investing in building houses. Now, you mentioned how it was that Keynes's theory laid out in the general interest in the 1930s ended up being more popular with economists, even though subsequent analysis, not just by Austrian economists but also by new classical economists and others, found a number of pretty significant holes or weaknesses in Keynes's theory. Why do you think that that his theory was so widely accepted and embraced if it had these serious flaws in it?
Well, I mean, we have to, kind of always remember that Keynes was advocating for large amounts of government spending and large government programs, and this is very politically popular in times of crisis, especially. So with the New Deal, there's a depression going on and all of this spending. It's a popular program, and it's easy to go down politically, and that's one of the reasons that Hayek's theory itself is not very well known, because his policy implications are not politically popular.
So that was, I think, a nice question to lead into. What would be the policy implications that come out of the Austrian view, other than to not start bubbles in the first place?
Well, yeah, I mean, the Austrian or the Hayekian view would be to let the markets do its job, because Hayek sees the bubble or the boom phase as a giant misallocation of capital. So to him, the bust or the recession is a necessary correction. So anything that lets the market or the price system do its job of allocating resources and valuing assets at their true price is something that is good. So what we want is more entrepreneurship. We want entrepreneurs to come in to start businesses again. We want them to take risk. If entrepreneurs are uncertain about what the future is going to be, or they're made more uncertain because of government policy or the government playing with interest rates again, that kind of creates this uncertainty or a regime uncertainty where entrepreneurs aren't willing to take risk again. That's something we don't want. We definitely want more entrepreneurs who are willing to come in onto a level playing field. So any policy that creates a level playing field for the market and for entrepreneurs would be a good policy.
So you mentioned the issue of policies that create uncertainty. So once we got to 2008, the Austrian response would have been, we've just got to let housing prices adjust because we've invested too much and there's just no way to get around the problem.
That's true, as well as, let's not bail out banks, let's not, create more moral hazard by, bailing out losers. Well, here, if you look at this graph, and this is an example of, Keynesian policy, and the red line shows actual unemployment that exists between 2009 and today. And this was as a result of the recovery plan or a fiscal stimulus that was done in 2009, and economists or Keynesian economists were predicting that the dark blue line was what the unemployment rate was going to be. But what we actually see is the actual unemployment rate is much higher than what they even predicted it would be without their recovery plan. And this goes back to the point of ultimately it's the market that must, or entrepreneurs who are the part who create economic growth, and that's not happening with the fiscal stimulus.
And you also mentioned regime uncertainty, because that was a term that has gotten some discussion in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis and the recession. What's regime uncertainty mean? So
just the idea that with a lot of government policy that is unpredictable or it's new, entrepreneurs don't know what's going to happen in the short run or in the long run. So it creates uncertainty regarding whether or not they should invest and invest in the future. Because what's an entrepreneur doing? He's taking on risk and he's forecasting future demand for a certain product. He has to know that in the meantime, certain things or certain policy parameters are not going to change on him so drastically that it's not going to be worth it anymore to get into business. And that is definitely a problem right now. We do have this problem.
Well, unfortunately, we do seem to have this this business cycle, and in this case, the circle is this comic illustrates that we tend to go through these cycles of boom and then bust, and now I guess we have bailouts added in, and as you suggested, the very low interest rates that we have now might be fueling yet another round of unsustainable investments that are going to have to be reversed at some point in the future. Well, thank you very much for coming on. We've come to the end of our time. I think it was a very interesting conversation. And thank you for tuning in. Join us again next week for another EconVersation.